Good day, folks. This is Bob in the house. You say, what's in a name, right? What the hell? India, Bharat, right? India is anyway India in English. Bharat is anyway India in Bharat in Hindi. So both the names exist. Why the excitement to try and change everything and call it Bharat? Why had the invitation go out? President of Bharat. It should have been Bharat ka Rashtrapati if you really wanted it to be right, and it should have been in Hindi, right? That was the real way to do it. Instead of you look pretty stupid, right? But changing names for a country this size, do you really want to be in the company of banana republics? Look at what happened to the first neighbor that changed its name from Burma to Myanmar, or the other one Ceylon to Sri Lanka. Well, these are small countries, right? Ours is big. Look at the advantage we have. We are known by the Indian Ocean, the Indus River, Indian Ocean. Where we are because of geographically we straddle the Indian Ocean. We know because of the Indian Ocean. Look at China, right? China does its best, right? South China Sea, because it's got a name of China. South China Sea says everything in that belongs to China historically, because that's why it's called South China Sea. We, on the other hand, are gifting the Indian Ocean away. Nobody's going to change the name to Bharat Ocean, right? Anyway, having said that, it's a geopolitical joke. You know, we can spend our time changing name of streets and changing name of capitals and changing name of cities. But to go ahead and try and change the name of a country, that's kind of stretching, especially the country that is trying to be the leader of the South. How is this going to go down in the rest of the world, right? I don't know, right? And then where we've gone wrong in China and Russia, as far as our foreign policy is concerned, is slit, right? Because we continue to see China as this cuddly, benign panda bear, right? Even Nehru, right? There's enough evidence now to suggest that Mao had already decided to attack India in '59 because he didn't want India to take Nehru to run away with the leadership of the South, right? Same thing is happening now. History repeating itself. It's Xi and Mao are the same thing. It's not the Deng Xiaoping period, right? Same thing with Russia. This is Putin's Russia. This is not the old Brezhnev's USSR, cuddly USSR, right? These are two real new animals, right? And we got to take them accordingly. We've seen how all these unofficial meetings and how body language between Xi and Modi, how it's adversarial to us. It's humiliating to us. One, we have him jumping to shake his hand in Bali. In South Africa, we've got this picture of Xi sitting like a king and Modi is standing on the side. But another picture where Lula and the South African president jumping all over Xi and our prime ministers in the background. It's really, really shameful, right? And you knew this was going to happen in the G20. You really were not going to straddle this tightrope. It was impossible. We couldn't. Xi may skip G20 Chinese premier likely to attend, and that's happened. Xi's absence at G20 summit won't reflect on host country. It absolutely is, because everybody in the world is talking about bigger bricks won't make a stable building. That's exactly what I've always said. It says already riven with a Sino-Indian rivalry, the group will become even less coherent by expanding. And I started that, what is the name with this? G20 invite by President sparks Bharat India round. New Delhi, Beijing differ on details of Modi-Xi meeting, and that's exactly what happens. Modi keeps divided, and the EAM keeps demanding these unofficial meetings. There's nothing called unofficial, and then he lets the cat out of the bag. How he loves to work with this prime minister because he thinks out of the box. But unstructured foreign policy just doesn't work, guys. Just doesn't work. And South Africa and the G20 is there for everybody to see. Gap between Delhi, Beijing, China is silent on LAC pullback, repeats old stand on ties. China proposes another round of talks after Modi-Xi meet. BS. Xi and Modi agree to intensify efforts for expeditious disengagement from along LAC. How disingenuous. Modi-Xi agree to step up LAC peace efforts. Modi-Xi meet on BRICS sideline, agree on expeditious de-escalation in Ladakh. Really, guys. And this is what it really is. It's Raji Bagchi. Xi, who is not coming. China holding up consensus on Ukraine paras and its leaders skipping the meet are aimed at degrading India hosted G20. But Beijing's joust with New Delhi will continue long after the summit. Degrading. Just like Mao did with Nehru, right? Indians are finally realizing that China would never want a successful India summit. It's part of the larger effort to limit India's rise. At the latest bilateral meeting between Modi and Xi in Johannesburg on the sidelines of BRICS summit, both India and China came away with different interpretations of resolving the border standoff. That was an early sign. Indians thought the two leaders had reached an understanding that officials would take forward and implement. The Chinese official statement said India had asked for that meeting and advised that the two sides should bear in mind the overall interests of their bilateral relations and handle properly the border issue so as to jointly safeguard peace and tranquility in the border region, which simply meant the standoff stays exactly where it is. Okay. Modi-Xi meet was informal, though China had sought a bilateral, says government. China rejected that. Modi-Xi agreed to expedite disengagement along LAC. India, China end longest border talks on positive note. Like this Dipanjan Chaudhary and Manu Pabi. China PLA, then why are China's PLA scaling up in Aksai Chin? Satellite data, right? Why is IAF conducting mega drills amid LIC row with China? Why? And why is this? China's 2023 map claims Aksai Chin, Arunachal, India protests. And what do we have to say? China habitual offender. Right. India protests China's latest map. Jaishankar says absurd claims are Beijing's old habit. But on the ground too, Jaishankar doesn't tell us they're changing the LSC, folks. They've changed it in Ladakh. They're changing it near Arunachal. Hey, more China neighbors fume at its new map. Now this is the problem, right? Why we get this news is because we want to say like China is doing it to everybody. So hey, what's the big deal? But it matters because it's India. And in India, they're actually taking our land. Under new map, China claims Russian island. US okays aid to Taiwan under plan for sovereign states. China hits out at India over ties with Taiwan. And look at the audacity of the Chinese envoy in Nepal. Envoy slams India's Nepal policy, calls it less than ideal. This is, folks, China's ambassador to Nepal. Look at the audacity. Okay? And we think this is a cuddly toy, right? We can play it. We can't. Hanoi risks angering Beijing by elevating strategic partnership with US. China's largest property developer at risk of default, imperiling economy. They're in deep dive. Team on Bhutan-China border row holds its first meet. This is Nepal and Bhutan. China, right? Bhutan, on the other hand, looking at a slice of India's growth pie. Then you have China's rate caution reflects fears over banks, housing, demand declines in China. Chinese economic recovery still shaky. Then you have trapped in spiral of deflation. Chinese are surrendering to despair. China pays for economic mismanagement. The bill is coming due for Beijing's rejection of free enterprises in favor of communist ideals. China's sluggish economy will weigh on global trade. Berlin plans to curb investments from China. Many watch nervously to see if China will bolster its failing property market. It just can't, but it's too big to fail. A Soviet-style collapse is unlikely, but China is on shaky economic grounds. Then you have China's chip tool imports jump ahead of Western restriction. But this is what I read out. This is a long read out. So I'm going to try and take it slowly, but it's a very critical readout that you've not seen. Sushant Singh in foreign policy. It says India can't cut the cord from China. Amid a stalemate at the border, it's clear that Xi Jinping still has the upper hand. Europe and United States have largely chosen to look away, but in May, the European Union objected to a direct shipment from Russia's Rosenfeld oil company destined for India's biggest state-owned refiner. As a result, the Reserve Bank of India refused to allow payment to Moscow in either euros or US dollars. The state-owned refiner went to another bank and ended up paying for the Russian crude in Chinese yuan. This gave a boost to Beijing's efforts to internationalize its currency. India's stridently nationalist government was likely left embarrassed by the incident. Okay, you got to keep hearing this. Meanwhile, though, Indian companies continue to use yuan to pay for 10% of country's Russian oil supplies, and New Delhi remains silent on the issue. The yuan payments show how India's dependence on China has only grown in the past 3 years. Despite the fraught situation on the border, bilateral trade has increased and the trade balance has tipped further in China's favor. Breaking previous vows, India's ministers solicit Chinese investments. You haven't heard this, folks. You're hearing it now. It's not in Indian newspapers. New Delhi is conceding to demands from electronic manufacturers to make it easier for Chinese engineers to get visas. India is the biggest recipient of financing from China-based multilateral banks, and Modi and his ministers are enthusiastic participants in both BRICS Group and SCO, two groupings dominated by China. There has been substantive diplomatic engagement between the two sides through these multinational forums, but when it comes to the border dispute, Beijing has refused to make concessions. China has put additional diplomatic pressure on India, including by failing to post an ambassador to New Delhi's office since last October. Folks, do you know that? And here come further damaging stuff. This you heard it the first time because none of you applied to the foreign policy, and this is not on Indian press anyway. In July, a reporter asked Rajiv Chandrasekhar, the Minister of State for Electronics and Information Technology, if India is open to doing business with Chinese companies. Of course we are, Chandrasekhar said. That softening is in part because India needs Chinese investment in electronics, batteries and electrical vehicles. In January, New Delhi asked Apple to identify Chinese suppliers of parts who would be prepared to set up joint venture with an Indian partner. The Indian government gave 12 Chinese companies clearance to apply to start such businesses, but many of them initially seemed unenthusiastic since New Delhi had unleashed harsh measures against China's mobile phone producers for violations of tax and foreign exchange laws in 2020. However, a slowdown in tech funding in India in the past year means that the Modi government can no longer afford to be so strict about Chinese investment. Shutting the tap entirely had put India in a tough spot with an economy that remained stagnant. Despite Modi's much hyped Make in India plan, such as India's dependence on Chinese electronics manufacturing know-how, that in July it agreed to open faster visa processing for Chinese experts in installations, expansion, repair work, especially for those workers employed by companies approved under New Delhi's so-called PLI. India's heavy reliance on Chinese imports, including smartphones, semiconductors, solar cells, pharmaceuticals, is another challenge. 117 billion worth of goods traded between two countries last year. 87% were Chinese exports. India's 50 billion pharmaceutical industry is dependent on bulk drugs and intermediate goods from China's essential raw materials to manufacture finished products for domestic consumption and exports. Get that? Nothing has changed, right? India is also a major beneficiary of support from multilateral development banks based in China. This is damning as it can get. New Delhi is the largest borrower from the Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with 9.8 billion committed to projects since 2016, spanning energy, transport and public health. India is also founding member of a new development bank, the erstwhile BRICS Bank, that is based in China. With 20 approved projects and 7 proposals under review at 7.5 billion, New Delhi is the second largest recipient of the New Development Bank's financial support after Beijing. Oh man, we are in the dock. Since 2020, most of these conversations have focused on the border crisis. The stalemate on this issue seems to be in China's favor, with previous border management agreements now made redundant by this government. The differences between the two sides have only increased in recent months with separate official statements after border talks. That trend was only broken this month after a 19th round of discussion between senior military commanders. And the problem is because we've lied to the public because of domestic politics. India was surprised by the Chinese on the border 3 summers ago, and it is now caught on the back foot in negotiations. Back foot. China recently responded to India's offer to create a buffer zone at the sensitive areas of Despang and Ladakh by instead proposing buffer zone 15 to 20 kilometers inside Indian territory. Has anybody told you that, folks? Further cementing its ingress into the region. Has anybody told you that? India did not accept the Chinese proposal. In 5 other areas where Chinese or Indian soldiers have stepped back from their position by a few miles, Beijing has rejected any plans to move these soldiers back to their bases and has set about building significant military infrastructure in the meantime. New Delhi never publicly acknowledged the violations. Differences in messaging between the two countries have caused some embarrassment for India. When Indian National Security Advisor Ajit Doval met top Chinese diplomat Wang Yi in South Africa in July, the Chinese readout referred to an important consensus reached between Modi and Xi at last year's G20 summit in Bali, and nobody had told us about that. India never mentioned such a consensus. 3 days after Beijing's July statement, New Delhi had to admit that Modi approached Xi in Bali not only to exchange pleasantries, but also to discuss the need to stabilize bilateral relations. This is how low down we've had to stoop. This admission likely didn't play well with Modi's domestic audience because it drove home the starkness of India's empty quiver when it comes to targeting China. Militarily, India finds itself in a predicament of its own making. A poorly prepared force suffering from critical shortages in weapons platforms and spare parts, as well as a shortfall in soldiers. And then we have the Agniveer. Russia has stopped providing many supplies due to large pending payments of over 3 billion, further impairing India's military. As a result, India's foreign minister has ruled out even a limited offensive option against China, essentially tying the military down with defensive deployment on the border to prevent further loss of territory, which is not happening. Not happening. Jaishankar's ministry has never summoned a Chinese diplomat to issue a démarque on any of the issues, not even after the death of 20 Indian soldiers. Do you get that, folks? What an insult. This has further signaled New Delhi's weakness. China does not initiate talks on the border situation and often takes weeks to grant India's request for such discussion. Do we even know that, folks? After attending a think tank event in Beijing last month, former Indian Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, a long-time China hen, reported that he found no willingness on China's part to return to the border's prevailing status quo from before 220 Ladakh clashes. That is the reality. But Modi has no aces up his sleeve in these negotiations, while Xi could threaten to not turn up for G20 meeting summit, as they've been suggested by some Chinese analysts, and ruin Modi's party. Well, folks, he's done it. Modi, Jaishankar and their advisors cannot avoid the reality that India is losing ground to China, but China has often erred in seeing India through the prism of its ties with global superpowers. It may be repeating this mistake by reacting with aggression, in part in response to India's deepening relations with the United States, seeing India as part of the US design to contain Beijing. New Delhi's partnership with DC can help to deal with an assertive Beijing to an extent. Still, India must develop its own strength on its own terms, both as a vibrant liberal democracy and as a military economic power. Indians need to do the heavy lifting themselves. Nothing else will serve the country's purpose. Real sad situation, and obviously the delinking is a slow process, but this seems to be complete surrender and a lack of will to take tough action. She has figured this out. This article is the reality of how domestic politics have ruined our stance against China. Also an opener on how Russia has actually stopped supplying equipment because of now non-payment, and the biggest one of worry is that number of soldiers have actually dropped. That, folks, is the reality. So you bugs, please get off that high horse. Anyway, 3 cheers, Jai Hind. Please subscribe to my channel. This is only where you'll hear the truth. Jai Hind.